Are you putting record on right now?
Oh, I guess so. Well, we have
I
1
think
minute.
we're live. Does it say? On my thing, it has like live 9, 10. I think we're live.
Oh, hi everybody! If we are
Hi
live,
everyone. If we are live, say hi or something if you're in the
say
chat.
hi
So
in the
yeah,
in the
in the
comments.
comments,
Yes.
yeah, so we know
Oh, we
whether or
are
not
live.
we're okay.
Thank you, Kat. This is working. This is
All right.
exciting. So this is a first for us, for sure, and it's fun to know that there are at least a few of you out there watching us live. Thank you so much for the Asian Author Alliance for setting this up and organizing just a really wonderful month of events celebrating Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And please go check out asianauthoralliance.com to see a list of all of the events. So for those of you who don't know me, as you can see, it says right there, I'm Alvina Ling. I'm editor-in-chief at Little Brown Books for Young Readers.
And I'm Grace Lin. I'm the author and illustrator of many books, including The Year of the Dog, Where the Mountain Meets the Moon, and A Big Moon Cake for Little Star. I realized I probably should have had my books, but you can see them all on my bookshelf.
This way. It's one of yours.
Anyway, Alvina, do you think we should do our podcast intro?
Yes. We haven't done this in a long time, but let's do our podcast intro. Yes, because we use a pre-recorded, but we're doing a live show. So here we go. Hi, I'm Alvina Ling.
And I'm Grace Lin.
And we're book friends forever.
We're childhood friends that grew up to be
a children's book editor
and an author and illustrator. It's missing the music.
I also realized I didn't press record. That's all right. I'm recording now. Okay, so welcome to Book Friends Forever, our Asian American Identities episode. Every week we catch up with each other's lives.
Are you still there? Ooh. You just froze on my side.
Am I back?
Okay, you're back.
Okay.
Wait, since we're live, let's stop the recording. We're also recording our podcast, and let's start again. We're going to welcome everybody one more time. Okay. Ready? So everybody gets to see our.
Okay.
Okay, I'm recording. You're recording.
All right. So we're starting the intro again.
I just welcome to Book Friends Forever, right?
So welcome to Book Friends Forever, our Asian American Identities episode. Every week we catch up with each other's lives, talk about what's on our minds, and share with each other what we're grateful for.
And if you enjoy our podcast, please tell a friend about it and check out our website, bookfriendsforever.com. The website will include more detailed show notes as well as links to the episodes.
And please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. And before we start, I wanted to mention that we're planning to leave some time at the end to answer any questions that any of you may have. So feel free to put any questions in the chat as we go. So we start off by catching up on each other's lives. So Grace, how have you been?
Let's start with you.
Okay.
Okay, Alvina, how have you been?
Well, we've been using the phrase pandemic fine or quarantine fine. The latter is a word that author Barry Lyga coined. So I am still pandemic fine. I'm still quarantine fine. They just announced at my company on Friday, and I know other publishers have announced the same thing, that we're not going back into our offices, our physical offices, until at least after Labor Day. So it's good to know that, but it's also, I mean, it was kind of expected, but it's still a little daunting. I mean, I guess it's good to kind of know what to expect. But I think what we're all dealing with right now is the uncertainty and not being able to make plans. And I make plans. I'm a big planner. So that has been tough for me, but I've, just taking it day by day, week by week. Every week is the same.
I think it's hard though to say anything about work until school gets back in. I mean, people can't go back to work until kids can go back to school, I feel like.
Right. And I have to imagine that our office will still be socially distanced. So I think they'll probably still encourage people to work from home as well. But I don't know. It's a different world. I mean, a lot of other companies, like I think Facebook and at least one other company, they announced that people aren't going back until next year. And I think Twitter announced that their employees can work from home indefinitely. So it's going to be, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of exciting to see what's going to change. I'm interested to see what's going to change in our industry. I mean, I think we are lucky in the sense that we, for the most part, can all do our jobs remotely.
So what do you think is going to happen with all the conferences and things? Like I just got something for NCTE that wants me to confirm whether or not I'm going in the fall. And I'm like, are we really going to have NCTE? What do you think?
I really don't know. Where was NCTE going to be this year?
I'm forgetting, but there's so many conferences and things like that that's going to happen that were supposed to happen in the fall.
I know we're looking at our fall tours right now, and we're not sure if they're going to happen now. I mean, we, in a way, we're talking to the authors and talking about what they're comfortable with, and some authors are saying, no, let's move to all like virtual events. And other authors are like, well, let's plan it as if it was going to happen and reevaluate as we go. So that's, we don't know. I feel like that's the
I know
been the mantra.
Before this dragged out so long, when things started getting canceled, I was just I was saying to places like, oh no, well, just reschedule me for next year. Like there's all these conferences and like, we're going to go virtual. And I was like, you know what, just schedule me for next year, because it's kind of too crazy for me to try to do all this virtual stuff with like the family and all these things. But now I'm realizing, oh, there might not even be a conference or a school next year, so it's for me to go to. So it might be 2 years before I'm actually able to see people in person again. So it's a very interesting thing to come to terms with, I think, and try to figure out what to do from there.
It is true. Well, so how have you been? I know yesterday was your birthday, so happy birthday.
Yes, yesterday was my birthday. Thank you. Yesterday was my birthday. It was really nice, actually. I actually think it was one of the nicest birthdays I've had in a while because my husband got a rainbow cake for me. He ordered it online because he wanted it to be a surprise. So I didn't think we were doing anything. So he ordered it online, a rainbow cake. He's like, oh my gosh, the shipping for this was so crazy. But it was so sweet, and like he was trying to time it.
Was it sweet in many different ways?
Yes, it was sweet in many different ways. But what was really sweet was he was trying to time it so when we were doing our brunch, that he and Hazel would come up with the cake so we could all sing happy birthday together. But we're having so many problems with Zoom and so many problems technically.
Yeah.
Like we couldn't get on, and then like Hazel kept coming up and being like, oh, and then stomping back down and like waiting for everybody to get on so we could sing happy birthday until I think we finally did it, but it was so
well, Alex, like he kept texting me and saying now, and I'm like, no, we're not on yet. And finally, I think we just said, but then I said now, and then so Libby and I sang, and then they didn't come. So it was anyway,
but I very much appreciated the sentiment. And I was surprised. And it was funny because I was kind of getting stressed out because our tech wasn't working, and I was like, oh, maybe this. And then they came in with the cake. I was like, what? What are you doing? So it was really nice. Yeah. And I also wanted to give a shout out to my good friend Lisa Yee, who got married yesterday. They got married on my birthday. Because
You'll always remember their anniversary. That's exactly why she did that.
I'm sure she did it just for that reason. So they got married in the coronavirus. So they have all these wedding photos where they're wearing masks.
I saw that on Facebook. So cute.
So that was really nice. And so those lovely events are happening in the midst of all this craziness. I mean, I think for me, I feel like there's so many people that are like, oh, what should I do? Should I take up knitting, or people who
sourdough,
or sourdough? And I'm like, oh my gosh, I need more time. Like I just feel like I'm always on the run now because of everything that I have to do. I even tried to get out of recording this podcast too. So I keep trying to shave things off, but not quite getting that you should
I
take
know.
off.
You emailed me at 5:30 in the morning
I was like,
saying, "Should
maybe
we
we should
cancel?" I'm like,
cancel
"What do you mean?" No. We are happy to be here.
I am happy to be here. It's just that I was trying to see what could I shave off of my schedule for the day.
Yeah, you're a little overextended.
Yes.
Well, I feel like if for anyone who has listened to our podcast over I guess it's been a little over a year, you know that the theme of Grace's like, how was your week was, I'm so busy. So, that hasn't changed. And that's fine. Well, speaking of Lisa Yee, I thought we could segue into what's on our minds, which is our Asian American identities and how that's informed our work. So if you're interested in this topic, we actually covered some of this in our episode. I think it was episode
It was
29.
29. Yeah.
Yes. Asian Americans, not exactly the same. And that was with our guest star, Lisa Yee. We recorded that when I was up in Northampton visiting. But let's see if we can cover some new ground. It might be some familiar, some new. But let me start by asking you, Grace, when were you first aware that you were Asian American? Do you remember?
Oh, that's a good question. I feel like it was really young. It's probably as early as maybe even nursery school. I mean, I think that my Asian identity has been something that has that I'm always aware of. I think because of that, because of where I grew up. I grew up in upstate New York, where we were one of the very few minority families in the whole area. And for a long time, especially in my elementary school, we were the only Asian family, or I was the only Asian girl in my elementary school, except for my sisters. So I always kind of had this odd sense. I always knew I was different than the rest of my classmates. And I think it's always been on my mind one way or another. Like, maybe it's in the back of my mind, maybe it's in the side of my mind, but it's always been there, this kind of feeling of being Asian American, like being different from I guess what we would call the mainstream now, but back then it was different from everybody else. So I would say pretty early. I think as soon as I realized that there were other people around me other than my family. So maybe nursery school, but definitely kindergarten.
Yeah, I think for me, it's the same. I know at the very least, I was aware of being different in first grade. So in first grade, I went to a Catholic school. I was living in a suburb of Pittsburgh, and it was a very white community. And my school was all white, and I was the only Asian person in would say the only non-white person in my class. And in this Catholic school, they had a day called, I think it was All Saints Day. I mean, that is a day, that is a holiday. But in honor of All Saints Day, they had people go to a room of the saint that they're named after. And there is no Saint Alvina. And so they asked me what my middle name was. And I remember, as a little, 6-year-old, I knew that my middle name would not also be a saint because my middle name was my Chinese name. So I just kind of clammed up because, I was embarrassed and I didn't want to say, but I also knew that it wouldn't help if I said it. So I wouldn't tell them. And so they called my older brother, who's 3 years older than me, and they brought him into the office and they said, what's your sister's middle name? And he said, Yo Son, and then they kind of laughed. And I know they weren't laughing at the name, they were just laughing at the situation. But of course I was mortified. So, I definitely was aware then that I was Asian American, that I was different. And then the other example, and stop me if you've heard this before. Just kidding, don't stop me because you can't. But no, this is a story I tell a lot actually at conferences. So this was even pre going to school. My parents would always read books to me when I was, before bedtime. And I didn't remember this story. My father told me the story, I would say when I was 10 years into my career. And actually, we had gone to the North American Taiwanese Women's Association and had spoken on a panel there. And after the panel, my father said, hey, do you remember this? When you were little, I was reading books to you before bedtime. And afterwards, you said, Daddy, why do all the characters have yellow hair? and he was a little bit at a loss and didn't know what to say. And he said, I guess that's just how the authors and the artists decided to draw them or create them. And I told him, when I grow up, I'm going to change that. And so my father told me that story because I had already, like 10 years into my career, had already helped change that. But so I was definitely aware, like reading books that none of the characters in the books that I was being read looked like me. So.
Yeah, well, it's kind of cool. I mean, like, because now here we are and you're making books and with so many Asian characters. But the thing that we're talking about with your name, that reminded me, I think that might have been, I have a similar story, which I actually put in my book, The Year of the Dog. But I remember, I think it was in kindergarten, because before, or maybe even nursery school, but it was before, everybody called me Pacey because that was my Chinese name, my middle name, Pacey. And then I finally went to school and they said, what's your name? And I said, it's Pacey. And they're like, no, that's not a real name. And they looked through and then they found out, oh, your real name is Grace. And like now that you're at school and you're like, now you're a big girl and you're at school, it has to be Grace. And I was like, okay. And so like, and so that's why I'm Grace Lin now instead of Pacey Lin for my whole life.
And I still, because I met you as Pacey, and so I kind of interchange by calling you both Grace and Pacey.
I know, it's a very interesting thing, like who calls me Pacey and who calls me Grace.
Yeah, it makes sense. How did you feel when Dawson's Creek came out and there was a character named Pacey?
I know, and I was like, wait, how come he can have the name Pacey?
It's a name, it's a real name. Yeah.
I know. But I guess it was quite a while ago. Back then it was like 15 Jennifers in the class. So I think that anything outside the norm was very, very hard. I also, when I think about when we grew up, it was a much different time. I mean, we're so embracive of diversity now, not just racial, but like all different kinds of diversity, just in like the name Pacey. Oh, okay. But I mean, back then, I remember the big thing was to be really homogeneous. I remember my dad when he was going to go buy a new car, he would go and he would kind of scope out what all the cars the neighbors had, and then he would go and buy the exact same car, make sure that they were like the same. So
right, that's true. We all wore, we wanted to wear the same thing. Has that changed actually in school now? I don't know.
I feel like it has. I think that there's been a big I'm not 100% sure, obviously, because like I don't go to school, but I do feel like there's been a lot more value on individualism now than back then. I mean,
well, I know when I was a kid with my name, I hated my name as a kid because it was unusual. Everyone pronounced it wrong, but they would say Alvin, they would say Alvina. Actually, my Google Home still says Alvina. It drives me crazy. But now, I have, two of my nephews have really unusual names, and I was really worried early on that they might get made fun of. And then I realized, nowadays so many kids have really unusual names. And then you look at Elon Musk's kid. I don't even know how to pronounce that name. So like, it's fine. People are proud. They should be proud of their unusual names.
Yeah, I think so. So, I think that we've come into it's a great time in some ways where we're finally being much more embracive of individuality and diverseness. But we still have so many ways to go. And then and Elon Musk's name is a little unusual.
Special. It's special. Yeah. So how would you describe your identity, I guess, as an Asian American, both like maybe when you were growing up and then now?
That's a good question. So as a child, or not even maybe all the way until, I would say almost all the way until graduating from college, I would say that I would definitely be what in The Year of the Dog I called a Twinkie. Where it was like you look Asian, but you feel white on the inside. You're like white on the inside, yellow on the outside, right? And very much so, my whole life as from a child to teenage years, really just trying really hard not to be Asian and just kind of cursing my outside for not matching my inside, So that was it's only been the, I think I would say college to now that I finally have really embraced the Asian American, like the wholeness of it all. How about you?
Oh, wait, first I have a question, and I told
Okay.
my family I would ask you this question.
Oh no. Okay.
You could maybe guess what it is. Do you consider yourself Taiwanese American or Chinese American?
That's a good question. I think now, see, now, if when you ask me the question, I would say Taiwanese American. But my whole life, when I was younger, we were always told that we were Chinese, right? Because of the whole Republic of China and Taiwan thing. So every time when I was younger, we always said Chinese, Chinese, Chinese. And like,
Mhm.
so much so that now that's my first inclination when somebody asks me, I say, oh, Chinese. And I even say that with, that's what I say without thinking. But when I think about it, I'm like, oh no, Taiwanese. So it's a very hard thing because my first reaction is always to say Chinese because that's what we were told we were, like the whole,
By who? By your parents?
yeah,
By
by my
yeah,
parents, by honestly, my relatives
everybody?
too. Yeah, my relatives in the United States, like, and then all of my, people who weren't Asian were telling me I was Chinese. So I was like, okay. So it's only like it's only been in the last, like, I would say 15, 20 years that my parents have become much more aware of like Taiwan and like
Yeah.
like Taiwanese pride, and then like, and me slowly realizing, oh, yes, there's a big difference, So so it's really it's really interesting because often when I'm nervous and some not when I'm nervous or I'm not thinking, when people ask me, that my first thing I'll say Chinese. But if I
Mhm.
really like take a step back and I think about it, like when you ask me directly now, I'll be like, oh no,
Yeah.
Taiwanese. So
Well, if your parents were like mine, and so when I was very young, and we talked about like the earliest like time that you understood you're Asian Americans. So as long as I can remember, my parents, because obviously they knew that I would be asked this question because all people of color are asked the what are you question. So I'm sure that they were asked, what are you all the time? And they always said Taiwanese. And so they trained me to say, they said, if anyone asks you, you're Taiwanese, not Chinese. Actually, I'm wearing my Taiwan Lang shirt
ah.
and my lounge pants, my fancy lounge pants. Yeah, I always knew I was Taiwanese American, but I didn't understand the difference until college, I will say. We went to, well, maybe a little bit before. I mean, I knew there was a difference, and actually, I remember getting an argument with my high school friend Jen, who because she's Chinese American, and so she did not believe that Taiwan was its own country, or that I could. She basically, so she was kind of brainwashed to be like, Taiwanese is not a thing. You're not allowed to say you're Taiwanese. I'm like, what are you talking about? Yes, I can. So we had to have arguments that were based on very little actual knowledge.
Well, I
But yeah.
remember now, actually. I
Hmm.
remember when you were in upstate New York and they are starting the Chinese Mohawk Valley Chinese Association. That's what it was called, the Mohawk Valley Chinese Association. And every year they did this United Festival of Nations. And so it was like all the not families, but minority groups of different areas would come, and they would have a booth of who they were. Like Japan would have the Japan booth, and like Ireland would have the Ireland booth. And I remember we were doing the Chinese booth, and your parents were so like upset that it was the Chinese booth when everybody who was in the club was actually Taiwanese. And so yeah, we were under China. Like, and that's why I think it was so complicated, because I remember my parents didn't understand why your parents were making such a big deal out of it, and they're just like, oh, we're Chinese, Chinese. But I do remember your parents, even when we were young, always like Taiwanese, Taiwanese.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating. But now I bet you my parents would very much be like, we should have said Taiwanese.
Right.
So
Well, because your parents go to all those Taiwanese organizations
now they
too,
do.
and yeah,
Yeah.
and when I was growing up, we would go, and you came with me a couple summers to the Taiwanese American Conference East Coast.
Yes.
It's like a little, like a family summer camp. I went once in high school. Oh no, I think I was a freshman in college. I went to TAF, Taiwanese American Foundation. Um, But then I was always confused because we were also sent to Chinese school. And like, so
Yeah.
Chinese, like Mandarin is like the language that, my parents spoke both Taiwanese. They actually mainly spoke Taiwanese at home, which
I
your
mean,
parents did too, right?
and the thing is that the culture really, this is what makes it so complicated because the culture overlaps so much. They like when you go to the National Museum in Taiwan, in Taipei, I mean, it's Chinese relics, like, and it's like they've, like it's all Chinese culture and all the stories and all the things. I mean, they are rooted in, I guess, what we would call
I
Chinese
mean,
culture.
what I would say the overlap is similar to the UK US overlap.
Yeah,
So,
probably.
you
That's
okay, so let's move on to how do you feel being Asian American has informed your work?
Oh, okay. So that's an interesting question. So, I was thinking about this. I think that, when I was younger, when you were asking about like how I felt about being Asian when I was younger, and the fact that I didn't like being Asian, and I would kind of curse the way I looked on the outside and how it didn't match on the inside. But the times that I felt the most insecure, I would say, would be when I was with other Asians who were very proud of their identity or who could speak Chinese when I couldn't. And I remember feeling very I don't know, insecure, like insecure, very
Like imposter
yes, that's a good word.
syndrome?
Yes, very much an imposter. And so I think for a long time it was really hard for me to claim the Asian part of my identity and claim it just because I look it doesn't mean I am it, like kind of thing, because I felt like I didn't have any connection to it. So I feel like doing books on Asian culture has actually given me the power to claim my Asian identity. It's a lot of people think it's the other way around, like, oh, you're Asian and you're so Asian and that's why you do these books. But it's really not. I do these books to kind of learn about being Asian, and then like being like, I always talk about this when I talk about like Where the Mountain Meets the Moon and When the Sea Turned to Silver. Like those books, those are Asian folk tales, but I changed them and adapted them. And at first I was really nervous about that because I was like, oh, what are people going to think? Like I'm this mostly American, like changing these old folk tales, and what right do I have? But as I slowly like got myself into that work and like embraced it and enveloped it, I realized, no, changing these works, like to the way that feels right to me is what's actually giving me the power to claim the Asian part of my identity. Like, and that's what I realized a lot of my work has been trying to feel not an imposter with my culture, So I think that's what a lot of my work has been for a while. How about you?
Well, I think what we've already discussed a little bit is, of course, and we've talked about on past episodes about how both of us, I think, were hungry for Asian American characters in the books we were reading when we were kids, and how I remember the series that we talk a lot about is the Cheerleaders series. Not the R.L. Stein one, but the one Scholastic published, this Cheerleaders series. It was kind of like, I don't know, like teen girls in cheerleading. I mean, neither of us had any interest in being
Like
a
neither one of us
cheerleader.
like
Like
cheerleading.
soap operas, but they had an Asian American character named Hope, and I think we were so excited, I think, to find that out, and so we like read the whole series just because of that.
Yeah.
And so I think when I was trying to decide, I decided on book publishing, and then I was trying to decide if I wanted to do adult books, children's books, and it was actually, I was working at Barnes and Noble as a bookseller, and I kept gravitating to the children's section. And I realized, like children's books played such an important role in my childhood. And I feel like the lack of, seeing myself, Rudine Sims Bishops talks about, oh, is that her name? Rudine
Mhm.
Sims. Yeah. So
Yeah.
she talks about mirrors and windows. And so, we very rarely had mirror books where we saw ourselves mirrored back really exactly. And so, when I decided on children's publishing, I really thought, you know what, I want to work to try to bring more characters, underrepresented characters, to children's literature. And so that's really informed my career. And I feel really grateful. And I don't know, it just feels really fortuitous that it happened to be Little Brown that I got my start in, because so you and I were roommates in Boston when we were both starting our careers. And I remember we used to go to the library and the bookstores, and we would and I remember you said, oh, I found this series of books, and it was called Yang the Youngest, Yang the Middle, Yang the Eldest. And it was about a Chinese American family. And neither of us had seen a book like that when we were kids, and so we read the series. And that was different because it was an immigrant family, so it wasn't quite our experience, but it was still like the closest to, I think, our experience that we had read in children's literature up till then. And I interviewed with Megan Tingley at Little Brown, and she was the editor of that trilogy. And it's because she felt like there needed to be more Asian American representation, so I felt like, oh my gosh, like this is home. I'm working at a publisher that already has this as their mission, so I can just continue that work. So that's definitely.
What do you think has been the biggest challenge to that in these years of you publishing these kind of books, or trying to publish those kind of books?
Do you mean a challenge in terms of? Well, I think early on is probably discoverability. I think I never had I think finding the talent. I think there weren't a lot of agents submitting. When we at Little Brown and many other publishers only accept agents and material, so we weren't actually seeing a ton of submissions that had any kind of underrepresented characters, to be honest. And I felt like early on, I felt like I was one of the only editors, and it's not true. There are actually many editors out there who are also looking for these stories, but I felt pressure, I guess, and so I did a lot of revisions with authors, that I didn't quite feel that they were ready to go to acquisition. So I would do a lot of revisions before bringing books to acquisitions. But
so
I never.
When you feel pressure, did you feel more pressure to bring in diverse books, or?
I felt pressure because it was my personal mission that I wanted to acquire diverse books. And I felt like, oh, if I don't acquire this one that this agent is submitting to me, no one will. That's the pressure I felt back then. I don't feel that anymore. I feel like, a lot of editors and publishers are looking for diverse voices and diverse characters. So that piece of the pressure is off now. So now I'm really happy. I mean, I'm at a point in my career where acquisitions are not my main focus. But I'm super happy when I get submitted something that I really like, but I feel like maybe I'm too busy or I don't love enough to take on, and they get an offer somewhere else. And I'm like, that's great. I'm so happy this is being published. I don't necessarily have to be the one publishing it. So I think that's been the difference.
I think it's really interesting because when you mentioned the pressure, because I remember early on in my career, I felt a lot of pressure because my first book was The Ugly Vegetables, and I kind of fell into the multicultural thing, and getting a lot of notice for it because it was one of the very few Asian books out there at the time. I mean, now, like I said, so much has changed, but that was like 20 years ago, and I remember feeling so much pressure, and that was what we were talking about, the imposter syndrome. And I was like, oh gosh, like people think I know so much about Asian culture, and like, oh no, it was like this pressure of like trying to be everything when it's just impossible. Even if I could speak Chinese, even if I knew so much more about my own heritage and my own culture, it still would have been impossible. So that's what's so interesting about being Asian American in this industry.
Yeah. And, I'll just say that I think, I'm sure like 99% of Asian Americans have imposter syndrome. I just think that's kind of the natural feeling of being pulled, you don't fit in either world fully. So you're not alone. I mean, I definitely have imposter syndrome. For me, it was the language, like not knowing the language and not being able to speak it with my parents. And, so in college was when I started taking Mandarin. I took Mandarin for 2 years. And then it was really when I moved, after graduating, I moved to Taiwan for a year to study Mandarin. And that's, I think, when I really kind of felt much more, comfortable, I guess, in my Taiwanese American identity, because I felt much more in touch with Taiwan. And I learned both Mandarin and Taiwanese, not fluently, sadly, but, conversationally.
I remember one of the biggest things, and I'm forgetting her name, but when I was in 2016, I went to the White House for as a champion of change for Asian American and Pacific storytelling, and the person who was kind of not exactly emceeing, but kind of presenting and was like kind of the awards or the honors. She was like Obama's. Now I can't remember what exactly she fulfilled. Her position was underneath Obama, but she was part of his team, and she was Asian, and she very not proudly, but very matter of factly say, I'm Asian. I don't speak any Chinese, but that doesn't make me any less Asian. There's no litmus test of how Asian you are. And I remember when she said that, all of a sudden I felt this like loosening, like, oh, especially because I was like, oh my gosh, what am I doing here? Like, it's that imposter syndrome, like, oh, I don't think I'm supposed to be at the White House for this. But when she said that, I was like, oh yeah, there's no such thing as being Asian American enough or not enough. You just are. So I thought that was a really, really cool thing that she said. That's really sad that it made that much of an impression on me, and I can't even remember her name.
I'll look it up. We'll put it in the show notes. Is there any other way that you feel like being, I guess, Asian American has? I mean, obviously, you write a lot. And I remember there was a period of your career where you wanted to do animal books, right? Because you wanted to kind of get out of that.
Yes, very much so. So like. Yeah, so The Ugly Vegetables came out, and then I think I can't remember. Oh, then I did Dim Sum for Everyone. And I remember after Dim Sum for Everyone, I just kept getting noticed as Grace Lin, multicultural author and illustrator, if I was noticed at all, right? And it was very much so like I was the Asian author and illustrator. So, and I
really did this book.
Yeah.
Round as a Mooncake.
Yeah, I did Round as a Mooncake, Red as a Dragon. So, and I love those books, but it's that imposter syndrome. I think looking back, it's mainly the imposter syndrome. I remember, and it's imposter syndrome on many different levels, not just the level of I'm not Asian enough, but it's also the level of being an author and illustrator. I remember going to SCBWI, Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, used to have all these, and they probably still do, all these gatherings where like aspiring authors and illustrators get together and talk and show their work. And I remember going to them. And whenever I showed my work, like, this is my first book, The Ugly Vegetables, this is my other book, Dim Sum for Everyone, there was always somebody who would say, oh, it's so good you're using your culture. That's what's getting you published, and it just felt like, oh, okay, I'm only getting published because I'm doing the Asian books. Everyone thinks I'm like sneaking in through the back window because of that. And so I remember really trying to do all these animal books, like I'm like, okay, animals don't have any race, they don't have any sex. Like I'll just
they do have sex.
Yes, that's true. But at the time I was thinking, they do have sex. Wait a minute.
That's a very funny statement. Anyway.
But anyway, they don't have any race.
Except pandas always symbolize Chinese people.
If this is our normal podcast, we were like, okay, cut that part.
We can still cut it out of the actual podcast.
So those who are live get to hear the part.
I have to do a plug for Alvina Flies. That was one of your animal books, named after me.
Because you would come home every day, and I'd be like, anything interesting happened today? And then you came home and you said, somebody spelled, they sent you a fax?
It was a foreign publisher, and they sent me a fax that says how long ago it was, and they spelled my name wrong. They spelled it Alvina with an O. And you said, that's funny.
that's the perfect name for a chicken because ova means egg in Italian. And so
Yeah,
that's when I wrote
the rest is
Alvina
history.
Flies, which was about chickens. See, I always love chickens. And
Yeah.
then I
I have
did
some
like,
art actually on my wall over there. I won't show it because my
and then I
apartment's a
had
mess.
and then I did books with like monkeys. I was
Yeah.
really trying to push. I guess there's always been a part of me that was, we were having an interesting conversation the other day with our good friends Anna and Libby. We're talking about things that trigger you, right? And
Hmm.
I remember one of the things that always triggers me is when somebody in passing or hints, or maybe don't even hint that the awards I won were because my books were Asian or multicultural. And that always gets me all riled up, but it's because of my deep insecurity. Like, because deep down I'm a little bit scared that what if that's true, And
Hmm.
so I don't know if that's ever,
Not true. It's not true.
it's one of those things that you tell yourself and
Hmm.
you know it, but you don't believe it, So
Yeah.
it's one of those things.
All right.
So
So we want to leave some time for questions. So let's move into our final segment, which is how we end every episode. And we end with what we're grateful for. So, Grace, what are you grateful for this week?
let's see. Okay, what am I grateful for? Okay, I'm grateful for the rainbow cake from my family for my birthday. I'm grateful that the weather is really nice now, and because the weather is so nice, my flowers are actually looking beautiful. Like, I'm having a really
Yay.
nice flower garden year. They were so good that for Lisa's wedding, I wanted to give her a gift. And so I went out into my garden. I was able to cut like tulips and daffodils and make a
Oh,
little bouquet and give them to her and I was like, in the past, like I would cut one daffodil and that would be, that's my only daffodil. But like, oh, I can cut like two or three and there's still some left. So that was really cool. And then, and then for Lisa's present, I commissioned my own daughter to make her a quack duck wedding gift, and so I was really grateful that we could do that. So that's what I'm grateful for. What are you grateful for?
um, I am grateful for a lot of things, but this week I'll talk about. Well, I'm grateful for community, for the Asian American community, and connection. I think the fact that we can do this live podcast. I mean, I don't think we would have done this otherwise. And not that I'm not grateful for the pandemic, but the silver lining of the pandemic is being able to do things like this and connect with people across the interwebs. And then I just wanted to share one story that I guess is also kind of pandemic connection related. So ever since for about 3 years, I've been composting, and but during this pandemic, they stopped picking up and dropping, letting you drop off compost. And so there is a website called Nextdoor, and I found this woman who lives in my neighborhood. And so she said, "Oh, I'll take your compost." But then, after a while, she's like, I don't know if I could take it every week because it's small. But so far, every time I text her, she's been able to take my compost. But I know she has a daughter. I asked her, how are you? Do you have any kids? And so she has a daughter who loves, is middle grade aged and loves graphic novels. So I thought, oh, I'm going to give her some books. So, I looked around my apartment to see what graphic novels I had. I think I just found like 4 books, and I, gave it to her in a tote bag. And she was I've never met this woman. I don't know what she looks like. I don't know what her daughter looks like, but it was just, I just leave the compost and I leave the tote bag on her stoop, and she got it, and she was super happy. But that connection I thought was just kind of special. But then while I was looking for the books, I came across a copy of The Plague by Camus, and that was actually my late husband Greg's, like, one of his favorite books, and I'd kind of forgotten that. I saw, oh, this book, oh yeah, it was one of his favorite books. And then I remembered that I had posted a quote. And so for those of you who are Facebook friends with me, you've seen me post this recently. But after he died, I posted a quote from Camus, and then I found a copy of his book, and he had actually underlined that same exact quote. And I just want to read it because I found it a little, I don't know, it was just a good reminder, both that first of all, the book called The Plague, but also the message. If there is one thing one can always yearn for and sometimes attain, it is human love. So I feel like we all can have a lot of love for each other during this time. So that's what I'm grateful for, to be reminded of things like that.
That's true.
Okay, so now we have some time for questions. We actually did have one question submitted in advance on our website, so we'll answer that one first, and then Kat can, and Grace, maybe you can look too in the comments to see if there's something you want to answer, but this is the question. We all know the dangers of a single story. Do you feel that publishers are doing enough to tell a variety of stories for any given culture in picture books? Sometimes I feel like publishers are focused on telling stories that show the challenge of being an immigrant, clash of cultures, where the focus of the story is all about the difference instead of just a universal theme of childhood. I guess I'm just waiting for some of those lighthearted books, just like Jasmine Noguchi or Stand Up Yumi Chung, which I'm seeing in middle grade, but not so much in picture books. I look forward to every Thursday for this podcast, and that's from Darshana. So, Grace, do you have any thoughts about picture books?
I kind of I kind of agree a bit. I mean, that's kind of why I did a big mooncake for Little Star and a big bed for Little Snow, because I really wanted to have Asian faces of kids front and center as the main character, but not about them being Asian or different. I wanted them to like have their own fun story. But I feel like what's problematic is too harsh of a word. But I think what gets hard with picture books is that too many times illustrators, and I'm guilty of this too, so I don't want people to think that like I'm judging or think, but I think so many illustrators feel like we could just change the color of the skin and that's fine. Like, we'll just take a story and we'll make that person Asian and we'll just make that person Black, And I think that it's only when I've become more of a writer where I've really dove deep into writing that I realized like we can't do those kind of superficial changes and just have any old story that was originally written as a white character and just like, let's make her Asian, let's just make her Black. I feel like that does an injustice to the cultures that we're trying to bring diversity, like bring into the mainstream. So it's like this kind of balance that we're trying to do. When I say we're trying to do, I would say authors and illustrators are trying to do. But I agree. I feel like we do need more. But I want to make sure that the ones that are created are ones that are not just done just because people are saying, "Hey, we need diversity." Like, let's just let's throw some dark skin on that character. Like that's very that's very shallow and a little insulting. So like it's more what makes a book Asian, what makes a book diverse is more than the skin tone of the character. And I think that's where we need to make sure that happens for picture books. And I think in the past, the way that we've done that is by having the problem be, even the ugly vegetables is Chinese vegetables versus, so I think it's something that we're all moving towards though, hopefully. What do you think?
No, I think the basic answer to are publishers doing enough is no, but we're trying. So yeah, I think, it's, I guess, the same story that we've been talking about for a long time is like, we're trying and it's getting better, but it's still far from where it needs to be. For sure.
Yeah. We were a couple episodes ago, I was talking about how I'm looking for a book that's an animal story, but the side character is a minority. Is like a person of color, like Mouse and the Motorcycle. But the Kevin, the boy, is actually Jasmine. Jasmine Takuchi. Like all these things that I'm trying to find, but we haven't been able to like that. When we get to all of those in, then we'll know that we're getting really to a good part of diversity in our collections.
All right. Kat, do you have a question for us? Oh, I know this person. I went to high school with her. So Sohi, hi Sohi. She says, my daughter asks, how did you decide to go with Grace as your professional name rather than Pacey? And then
Oh.
she spelled your name right later on. There you go.
You know, honestly, it's because I was called Grace by everybody in the world except for basically the four people in my the four other people in my family. So everybody, yes, and you. So and yeah, but yeah, only I would say only you and my family were the only people that called me Pacey. So for a long time, I identified as Grace, and honestly, it's still that. Especially when I started, it still had that imposter syndrome. Like Grace, I felt more like Grace than I did like Pacey. And now it's weird. Like now I feel like it's very interchangeable. Like it doesn't like it
well,
doesn't.
Pacey lives on in the Year of the Dog and the Year of the
Yes.
Rat and Dumpling Days.
Yeah. And like now my husband calls me Pacey, and like he doesn't like to use Grace, and so and because he calls me Pacey, my daughter calls me Pacey, which is really funny.
Oh boy. All right, next question. Ananya Rudra asks, what advice would you give an early writer who loves writing but doesn't know how to take it a step farther?
Okay. What advice would you give an early writer who loves writing but doesn't know how to take it a step farther?
I wonder if she means in terms of being published or being,
yeah, that's what I'm trying to figure
taking
out.
it to the next level.
Or like finishing the story. I'm
Let's
not
just say,
okay, the biggest advice that I give in general for anybody who wants to be a writer is two things. One, you've got to read like crazy, like just read and read and read. I talk about this often about how my most popular books, Where the Mountain Meets the Moon, Star Over the Sky, When the Sea Turned to Silver, those are books that were inspired by books that I read when I was younger. And I didn't like those books when I was younger. I thought they were boring. And yet they made such an impression on me that now they're like the foundation of what I write now. So you have to read everything, even things that you don't like, and even books that you think are boring. You never know how they're going to affect you. So I think that's advice number one, is to read. And advice number two is always to remember that what you're writing right now is not your best work. So it doesn't have to be precious. Just write and write and write. And remember, the next thing you write, your next project is going to be even better. So don't worry if this one isn't good. The next one will be better.
Great. Next question. Ridiculous blog. Do you think it's important to try to name Asian characters with Asian or as a non-Western names?
What do you think?
I don't think it's crucial. I mean, I think, my name is not an Asian name. It's also not, I don't know what kind of name it is, but, I think Asian, it also depends, like, is it set in Asia? Depends on the setting. If it's like set in the US, then no. I think a mix would be nice. I think, I mean, I was going to say last names could be Asian, but there are Asian Americans who don't have the Asian last name. So mix it up.
Yeah, I mean, so much, I have that other podcast, Kids Ask Authors, right? And so I had a question about characters and character names the other day. And the thing is that for me, I don't know if it's important or not important to have the Asian name, but so much of the name for me is indication of what the character is going to be like. And so what I do a lot is I look up Chinese names and I find out what they mean. And that's kind of like how I see the characters. Like Min Li really does mean quick and clever. And like after I found that name Min Li, and I'm like, she's going to be quick and clever. And that's how like her character kind of like evolved from there. And like, and like, so all of the Chinese names that I use, they always have some kind of meaning towards either their personality or something that's going to happen to them. Like Mr. Shan is the mountain, so there's so many things that I use to help me create the story. And sometimes that is the Chinese name, but I don't know if it's important if it's Chinese or not, so much as if it works for your story. I think that's the story is always the boss.
Right. Is there another question? Katya, happy birthday. I love seeing both of your faces here. My question is, can you speak more about your own voices? Oh, sorry. Speak more about own voices and how you feel about that.
Oh, we have a whole big episode about that.
We do. Actually, it was our very first live, like not live on a screen, but live in person. We at Simmons College or Simmons University. So you can go back and listen to that podcast. But we kind of disagreed a little bit. I mean, we
Yeah.
both agree that own voices, meaning like authors writing, their own backgrounds, is important, and we should try to find more and uplift them. I think my difference from the publishing standpoint is I'm about the story. I'm always about the book. And so when I'm reading the book and the submission for the first time, I don't always know the background of the author. So if I just fall in love with the story, and then I find out later, I'll do my research and I'll talk with the author and find out what connection, what research, if they are not writing from their own background. But I think there are some people who wouldn't publish something that is not own voices, and I'm not in that camp.
And I guess my viewpoint is very different. It's not from the publishing standpoint, it's from the author standpoint, and the author standpoint of what do we write, And my standpoint is more the fact that if you are trying to write a story with diverse characters, or like, that's what I'm not, you can write a story with the diverse characters. That sounds wrong. As the protagonist, like the main, if you're trying to write what would technically be an own voices story, like, why are you writing that? And if you think that you're writing it to help the cause and bring more diversity into the world, then I feel that you really have to look very closely at that. I'm not saying you shouldn't, but I am saying that that own voices is not an act of creativity. Own voices is a political act, and the way that you support more diversity in our field is by letting others write those stories. So, I'm not saying it's really hard, because I feel like whenever I talk, people get really mad at me. so
I feel that way too. I mean, that people get mad at me. So, I think that's the thing. It's like people are very passionate about this topic, and not everyone agrees.
But I try to do this. I try to explain to people, when we had this whole thing where it's like, men would say, oh, there's not enough spunky girl characters, so I'm going to help feminism by writing some spunky girl, strong girl characters, and that's a good intention. The intention is really very kind and very noble. However, what feminism needs, if they really want to help like the feminist cause, is not for them to write spunky girl characters, because women can do that just fine. What we really need is for them to write some male characters that embrace these feminine qualities.
Feminist male characters.
Yeah, feminist male characters. I mean, that's what we really need. And so when people want to write an own voices story when they are not of that race, I mean, maybe if you're trying to do it to help the cause, maybe realize that maybe the best way you can help the cause is to write a character of your own race and how they are helping the cause, not by co-opting somebody else's story. But it's very complicated.
Yeah, and there are a lot of angles.
I know.
I think we probably have time for one last question. Last question. It's so fancy.
I know. I'm so impressed. Let's see.
Oh, it's from Kat. How do you feel the industry has developed since you first started out when it comes to Asian stories? Where do you hope it goes from here? Well, I think similarly to the question that was submitted to our website, I do feel like kind of like the first stage of kind of Asian stories are the characters grappling with their Asian identity. One of the very early books that I published was a YA novel called Nothing But the Truth and a Few White Lies by Justina Chen. And it was about a half Taiwanese, half white teen who was struggling with, being biracial. And I feel like those are important stories. But I do think we now, have room for more. Like I half joke, but it's serious. Like I'm looking for an Asian Harry Potter, an Asian Bella. Like I think we need, just like fantasy, mystery, thrillers, featuring Asian characters and, where, it's not about them being Asian.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's where we need to go. It's not about them being Asian, yet that's where I was talking about before when we were talking about the picture books. It's like we need them to be not about them being Asian, but they still have to be Asian. Like we can't just make it a white character that has like dark hair, like black hair, like it's a very interesting thing. But that's why I'm like, that's why I was looking so much for like the animal book with the Asian side character, like all these things. I think that's where we go from here, where there's so many Asian characters, there's so many characters of colors that it becomes commonplace. Like like we're right now, like the norm, like that's why Kirkus does those reviews where they call out every race of the characters, because the default has always been white. And when we don't know what the default is, that's when we know we've done our job.
Is this going to kick us off when it counts down? If it does, thank you for coming, everybody.
Thanks
okay,
so much,
it did
everyone.
it.
Okay.
Maybe we should just do we have a little closing that we do for our podcast, so we can just do that. Sorry, my computer messed up. Okay. So we'll do the closing.
Okay.
Thanks for joining us. And thanks to Hachette Book Group, Hachette Audio, Little Brown Books for Young Readers, the Asian Author Alliance, and Alex at Pacey Work Studio for producing and editing this podcast. You can find me at Planet Alvina on Twitter and at Alvina Ling on Instagram.
And I'm at Pacey Lin on both platforms. We love hearing feedback, so keep tagging and messaging us on social media using the hashtag BookFriendsForever, or send us a message via our website, bookfriendsforever.com. You can also see more detailed show notes there.
And if you have any suggestions for future topics to cover, please let us know. And of course, please remember to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. And if you like this podcast, please tell a friend about it. I'm Alvina Ling.
And I'm Grace Lin.
Have a great week.
And don't forget to read. And that's the end.
Yeah, so if you don't subscribe, you can find us anywhere you get your podcast. And we usually try to post new episodes on Thursday. So and we usually record a week in advance, or a week and a half in advance. So today's, if you want to hear how it turns out, will be posted next Thursday.
Yes.
But thank you so much. This was fun to see you all here. So
thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Do I leave this?